On that cold Christmas Eve afternoon, as the El Paso sun departed with a pale, weak light that warmed neither soul nor bone, my son Ricardo pronounced the sentence that finally broke the last thread of hope I had stubbornly stitched into my chest. He stood impatiently near the door of my small sewing room, his expensive coat contrasting brutally with the peeling walls and the piles of scraps that represented my entire life. His wife, Monica, watched the scene from the hallway, her face a mask of poorly disguised contempt. I, with my trembling hands, deformed by arthritis, was still holding the designer dress she had thrown on my table, a stuck zipper being the pretext for their cruel visit. My delay in fixing the small defect, a consequence of the pain radiating through my fingers, was the trigger for his contained fury. "You know what? Forget about Christmas dinner tomorrow," he said, his voice low and sharp as the cold wind seeping through the cracks in the window. "You would only embarrass us." The sentence wasn't shouted. It was worse. It was delivered with a calculated calm, a final dismissal, as if I were an old, useless object that no longer matched the decor of his new, glossy life. He didn't see the mother who spent sleepless nights sewing to pay for his education, nor the grandmother who patched his scraped knees. In that instant, I was just a nuisance, a smell of must in his perfumed existence. The silence that followed his words was more deafening than any insult. The hum of my old electric heater seemed to mock my solitude, while the sound of their car driving away on the gravel street was the sound of a chapter closing, violently and definitively. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the pale face of my granddaughter Sophia, frozen in the doorway, tears streaming silently down her face. In that icy silence, with the smell of reheated coffee in the air and the sharp pain in my hands, something inside me changed. Sadness gave way to a cold clarity, sharp as the needle of my singer. I would not cry. I would not beg. I would sew. But this time, it wouldn't be to fix what they had broken. It would be to build something they could never tear. If you love Jesus and believe this story will teach us something, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes of healing and wisdom stories. Your subscription is an act of faith in your own transformation, and I ask you to join our community of souls who have been through something similar. The sound of Ricardo's car engine faded, swallowed by the noisy normality of the neighborhood, where neighbors were already starting to turn on their Christmas lights, and the smell of tamales and fruit punch began to float in the air. I remained frozen for a time I cannot measure, sitting on my wooden stool, Monica's silk dress still in my lap, a cold, slippery stain against the worn flannel of my own clothes. The expensive fabric seemed to mock everything around me. My Singer sewing machine, an heirloom of black iron and faded gold details, which had witnessed 3 generations of women in my family sewing dreams and mending realities. The piles of scraps overflowing from baskets and boxes, each piece a ghost of a life I helped to dress. The velvet of a quinceañera dress, the twill of a school uniform, the soft cotton of a baby's layette. My swollen, aching hands rested on the dress, inert. They were the hands of a worker, a map of prominent veins, arthritic knots, and thick skin marked by countless needle pricks. Hands that had rocked my son, applauded his small victories, and were now deemed unworthy of participating in his celebration. I looked around my makeshift studio, this small room at the back of the house that was my sanctuary. The smell of reheated coffee and machine oil was my perfume. The hum of the heater, my music. It was a poor world, yes, but it was a world of dignity. A place where honest work transformed the discarded into something beautiful and useful. Ricardo's words, "You would only embarrass us," echoed in the space, trying to contaminate my refuge with his shame. But the shame was not mine. Slowly, with the precision of someone who knows every inch of pain, I folded Monica's dress and set it aside, on a pile of dishcloths I needed to mend. I would not fix it. That was a repair I no longer owed, nor wanted to make. The offense was not in the broken zipper, but in the chasm it represented between his world and mine. I stood up with difficulty, my stooped body protesting with every movement, and walked toward the kitchen, seeking the comfort of a glass of water. That's when I saw her. My granddaughter, Sophia, was huddled in the dark doorway, a silent specter in the gloom. She was no longer crying audibly, but the wet tracks on her face glistened in the dim light from the kitchen bulb. Her eyes, large and sad, mirrors of a child's soul forced to mature too quickly, were fixed on me. She wore a sweatshirt from a brand I knew. It was very expensive, but it hung loosely on her thin shoulders, the long sleeves hiding her hands. She was the picture of neglect disguised as abundance, a paradox her parents carefully cultivated. They cared about dressing her in labels, but not with the warmth of a hug or the right fit of a coat that would truly protect her from the cold. In her arms, she clutched an old teddy bear, a veteran of many childhood battles, its fur worn and one of its button eyes missing. I recognized it immediately. I had made it from the scraps of a brown blanket for Ricardo's first birthday. That bear had survived falls, fevers, fearful nights, and the desperate hugs of a child who once loved me unconditionally. Seeing that toy, a reliquary of the love I had once received in the arms of my granddaughter, who was now witnessing the complete absence of that same feeling, was like a punch to the gut. Sophia said nothing. She just looked at me, and in her gaze, there was an apology for her. Father, a shared pain, a silent question. How can they do this to you? She was the only witness to my humiliation, and her presence didn't magnify it, but rather made it more real, more palpable. Pain, when witnessed by an innocent, acquires a different weight, a gravity that compels us to act. With a choked voice, so low it was almost a whisper, Sophia finally broke the heavy silence between us. She took a step into the kitchen, holding the worn toy out to me. The yellowish light revealed the tear in the seam of the bear's belly, from which a bit of the old stuffing escaped like an open wound. "Grandma?" she said, and the words sounded like a prayer. "Can you fix him?" In that simple request, in that question laden with childish hope, I didn't just see a broken toy. I saw my granddaughter's wounded heart, seeking repair in the only place she knew she would find unconditional love. I saw the reflection of my lost son, the boy who once hugged that same bear and who had now become a man, capable of discarding his own mother as one discards a broken object. The pain of being discarded, of being considered useless, was the same pain the bear and I shared. I took the toy from her hands, and my fingers, which had been aching with arthritis, now seemed to find a purpose. The worn fabric was familiar. Its texture brought back the smell of my son as a baby, the memory of his laughter. In that moment, the decision that had been forming in my mind like a cold fog solidified, becoming as real and tangible as the bear in my hands. Sophia wasn't just asking me to sew a toy. She was handing me the key, the tool for my silent response. I would fix this bear, yes, but I would do so much more. I would use my needle and my thread not to attack, but to reveal, to build a mirror made of fabric and memory, a gift my son could never forget. That night, in my little house on Christmas Eve while the city celebrated, I would begin to spin my justice, for something much greater was about to be stitched together. My son didn't always have a cold heart. I raised him alone under the light of my sewing machine, turning scraps into his future, stitch by stitch. Every piece I sewed for others was another hour of study for him. Every sleepless night was a step away from the poverty that surrounded us. He was my world. But then, he met Monica, and her world, made of appearances and luxury, began to swallow ours. Visits became rare, affection, a formality. The first time I felt the chasm between us was at their wedding anniversary party. Amidst the wealthy guests, Monica introduced me not as her mother-in-law, but as Elena, someone who helped raise Ricardo. With one sentence, she turned me into a servant, a stranger. And my son, standing beside her, remained silent, his silence the cruelest confirmation of all. In that lavish garden, under lights that offered no warmth, I understood that I had been erased from the very life I had built for him. The final humiliation came in my own home, which made it even more bitter. In front of my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had come to visit, Monica began to argue loudly about how my medical expenses were a burden on their budget. Ricardo, instead of defending me, sighed and said the phrase that became my sentence. It's one more worry, another mouth to feed. I was reduced to a burden, a line item on a ledger in the safety of my own home. Mrs. Rodriguez left, embarrassed, leaving behind a heavy silence and my pride in tatters. They had stripped me of my dignity in front of the only community I had. I looked at my hands, the same hands that had fed and clothed him, and saw them as useless. But in that envelope of despair, there was a truth that would change everything. The answer to my pain was on its way, and it would arrive in the arms of a sad child, holding an old teddy bear that needed mending. Okay. Act 4, Emotional Climax. Sophia handed me the old bear, and as I felt the worn fabric in my hands, a sharp clarity cut through my pain. That toy wasn't just a broken object. It was a messenger from the past, a ghost of the love that once existed. The tear in its seam was the tear in our family, and my granddaughter's request to fix it was a request to fix our history. In that moment, the sadness that had paralyzed me transformed into an unshakable purpose. I would not spend Christmas Eve crying for the family I had lost, but honoring the family I had built. Silently, I guided Sophia to her small room, tucked her into bed, and after she fell asleep, I returned to my studio. The night would be long, but for the first time in years, my hands, despite the arthritic pain, did not tremble with weakness, but with a fierce, silent determination. I would use the only weapon I ever had, my needle, my thread, and the memories only a mother can keep. I stayed awake all night, under the solitary light of my sewing lamp. The world outside was silent, a holy night silence that contrasted with the revolution happening inside me. I opened my old wooden chest, the guardian of my most precious treasures, the fabric scraps I had saved for nearly 50 years. Each piece of cloth was a chapter of Ricardo's life. With steady hands, I cut a square from his baby blanket, thin and soft from time. Next, a piece of the flannel from his first pajama shirt, printed with little rockets. I found the denim patch from the knee of the pants he ripped while learning to ride his bike, a patch I had sewn myself with red thread. There was a piece of his soccer team jersey, the fabric from his father's suit that he wore to his graduation, and finally, the pocket from the first shirt he bought with his own money. Each scrap was a memory, a sacrifice, an act of love, and I joined them, one by one, sewing not with anger, but with surgical precision, as if I were suturing a deep wound. In the center, I appliqued the little bear, now with both eyes and its body perfectly mended. On Christmas morning, Sophia, with a wisdom that didn't belong to her age, convinced her father to stop by my house on the pretext of picking up the bear. Ricardo entered with reluctance stamped on his face, impatient to leave. "Here it is," he said dryly, holding out his hand. I didn't just hand him the bear. Instead, I unfolded the small quilt I had worked on all night. The morning light illuminated the colors and textures, and the air grew heavy. He looked at the quilt, at first with confusion, but then his gaze fixed on one of the squares. It was the fabric from the rocket ship shirt. His fingers touched the scrap, and I saw a tremor run through his body. His eyes moved to the patched denim, to the fabric from his grandfather's suit. The arrogance on his face began to crumble, layer by layer, like cracking old paint. With a firm voice, without a hint of accusation, I said, "You kicked me out of your Christmas, Ricardo, but you can't kick me out of your life, because I stitched it, piece by piece." The quilt was not a gift. It was a mirror that reflected not my poverty, but the richness of my love and the depth of his ingratitude. The memories hit him like an avalanche. He didn't see old rags, but the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the unconditional love he had treated like garbage. His knees gave out, and he fell to the wooden floor, clutching the quilt as a drowning man clutches a life raft. For the first time since he was a boy, my son broke down and wept, a loud, ragged cry, coming from a place he had kept locked away for years. Between sobs, The only words he could manage were, "Forgive me, Mom. Forgive me." On that cold floor, clinging to the memories I had sown, the man he had become finally broke. The next morning, what he did would leave everyone speechless. We would like to feel your presence at this very moment. Please write in the comments which city you are watching us from and what time it is there now. By doing this, we create a network of energy and support for this story, a reminder that we are not alone in our battles. Each comment is a point of light in our healing process. That Christmas morning, something changed forever. After a long time crying on the floor, Ricardo stood up. His eyes were red and swollen, but for the first time in years, I could truly see him, without the mask of arrogance he always wore. He picked up the phone and, his voice still trembling, called Monica. I couldn't hear what she said on the other end, but his response was firm. "Cancel everything," he said. "The party, the dinner, everything. I'm not going. I'm home." He said the word home with a reverence I hadn't heard in decades, and I knew he wasn't referring to the mansion he shared with his wife, but to this small place full of scraps and memories. And he stayed. The three of us, he, Sophia, and I, spent Christmas Day in my cramped kitchen, eating the simple chicken I had prepared, the same kind he loved as a child. The silence was deep, but it was no longer a silence of pain or distance. It was a silence of healing, where the wounds, at last, began to close. Ricardo's change was not just a fleeting emotional outburst. The patchwork quilt became a map for his way back. Sunday visits became sacred. He didn't just bring money to fix the roof or paint the walls, which I now accepted not as charity, but as an act of restitution. He brought himself. He would sit with me in my studio, in silence, while I sewed, and he would ask me questions about his father, about my youth. He was trying to piece together his own history, the parts he had tried to forget. Monica rarely accompanied him. My world of simplicity and truth was a mirror she could not bear to face. But Sophia flourished. The sadness in her eyes gave way to a sparkle of curiosity and joy. She would spend hours by my side, fascinated by my hands. And one day, she asked me to teach her how to sew. Handing her her first needle was like passing a baton, an inheritance of strength that Monica could never buy. Inspired, Sophia and I started a small project in my living room. Once a week, we opened our doors to other women in the neighborhood, many of them with stories of loss and hardship as deep as my own. We taught them to sew, not just clothes, but their own lives. We called our little group the Thread of Memory. Together, we transformed old fabrics into quilts, bags, and children's clothes. And in the process, we transformed pain into purpose and loneliness into community. I regained control of my life, not with shouting or revenge, but with the quiet dignity of my work. I discovered I didn't need the luxury of my son's world to be rich. My wealth was in the respect of my neighbors, the rediscovered love of my son, and the light in my granddaughter's eyes as she made her first stitches. Today, I do not have a big house, but I have a home full of respect, and that no one can ever take from me again.